Welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here today, especially to our panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. So my name is Marissa Bell, and I'm a postdoc at Cornell University. I'm also the now vice chair of the Energy and Environment Specialty Group. So before we get started, I did want to put in a plug for the ESG virtual coffee hour following this session. Please do join us there. And after the coffee hour, we'll also be holding the second annual Energy Geography Futures Directions panel. I'll share some details in the chat in a moment, but I think it'll provide many synergies with the topics discussed here. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this panel on community engaged scholarship in energy geography, which I've co-organized with one of our panelists, Elvin Delgado. Elvin and I started thinking about this session at last year's AAG. So he had been thinking about ways that geographers can contribute beyond academia, thinking about applied and practical ways scholars can contribute to communities and their decision making. Me, on the other hand, I'm deeply interested in the meta processes of community engagement, conceptualizing it, facilitating it, strengthening it, and its centrality in furthering the field of energy geography. So our panel today brings in scholars from a variety of career stages and working on a variety of topics, but whose work touches on community engagement in a number of ways. So the panel is intended to explore the ways scholars approach and conceptualize community engagement. They'll share with us their experiences and perspectives in conducting community engaged work, the opportunities and challenges in conducting community engaged work, and we hope to touch on the importance of centering communities and how that might further the field of energy geography. So we have four very accomplished panelists with us today to discuss these various aspects of community engaged scholarship in energy geography. Unfortunately, Rupali Padki was unable to join us today, but Tom Patak has kindly agreed to serve as a panelist in her place. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Elvin Delgado. Elvin is an associate professor at Central Washington University. His research lies at the intersection of political ecology, political economy, and nature, and environment and development, with a focus on fossil fuel landscapes and the human-environment interactions therein. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Elvin.
Thank you so much, Marisa, for your invitation to be part of this panel and for your guidance in the process. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the other panelists who agreed to participate in this session. I will begin my intervention by providing a very brief overview of my research trajectory, and then I will share some insights on my perspective of community engaged scholarship beyond the confines of academia, as well as some challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned about conducting research in places far away, like in my case in Venezuela and Argentina, and engaging with a community and conducting research where you live and work. My research agenda focused primarily in understanding the complex relationship that exists between nature and society as it relates to the development of energy resources in Latin America from a critical perspective. I adopt a mix of ethnographic research methods that include structured and semi-structured interviews, focus groups, oral histories, participatory observation, archival work. And as you know, this type of data collection requires you to develop a very deep, long relationship with the communities that you work with. I began this line of research in Venezuela and applied ethnographic multi-methods approach to explore the socio-ecological consequences associated with the production of industrial salt for the extraction and petrochemical transformations of oil and natural gas and their impacts on rural fishing communities in Lake Maracaibo during the administration of late President Hugo Chavez Frias. Once I started my tenure-track job at Central Washington University in 2012, I developed a new research agenda, and this new line of inquiry adopted similar methodological and theoretical approaches used in Venezuela, only this time to explore the implications of hydraulic fracturing activities on rural communities in northern Patagonia, Argentina. This research explores struggles over shale development in the Vaca Muerta Formation in the province of Neuquén, and the implications of a rural community in Añelo, where the majority of these activities takes place. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I could not travel to continue my research in Argentina and decided to take advantage of this opportunity to develop a research agenda locally where I live, which is in Ellensburg, Washington, located in the center of the state. This research moved from fossil fuels, and in this case now explores the solar debate in Kittitas County to understand how multiple actors form different interpretations of land use laws and county zoning codes to decide the approval and location of 2 utility-scale solar projects in productive irrigated farmland. I would like to offer a reflection on local engagement in critical resource geography through an analysis of my own engagement in these debates that involve government officials, community members, private firms, environmental groups regarding the adoption of solar projects in the county. I refer to this engagement as the process by which a scholar interacts and gets involved with the community where she or he lives and works. My engagement in Kittitas County solar controversies was twofold. First, I am a county resident that will experience the potential socio-environmental and political economic implications of large-scale solar projects on a daily basis. Second, I am now an associate professor in the Department of Geography at CWU and have long-lasting research and teaching interest in energy issues. But when I started my tenure-track job in 2012, I led the creation of CWU's Institute for Integrated Energy Studies, which I directed for 4 years. And I also led the creation of a new Bachelor of Science in Integrated Energy Management, and I am still the director of this program. So it is in this context of these institutional positions that I have been drawn into not only debates about solar development in the county, but also local energy governance. As in 2017, I was appointed by the mayor of Ellensburg to the city's Utility Advisory Committee. At this moment, I would like to provide a brief reflection about some of the challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned regarding conducting research in places far away from home, like in my case in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and Argentina, and engaging with the community and conducting research where I live and work. Overall, I believe there are differences in how a resource geographer can engage with the community when this engagement happens in the place they live and work, as opposed to a non-local field site. I do not think the difference lies in the methods of data collection, as the systematic process of collecting, analyzing, and triangulating data should be the same regardless of where the process happens. But there are opportunities, lessons learned, and challenges. So let me now turn to the opportunities. I believe that there is a further need for critical resource scholars, political ecologists, and energy scholars to bring academic practices and theoretical conceptualizations of community engagement to resource issues and controversies where they live and work. And what I mean by that is my engagement with the community, long, lasting, deep-rooted relationships that are developed throughout decades of work and visits, as opposed to engaging in the community, applying your theoretical framework to kind of help in the implementation of policy where you live and work. So Staheli and Mitchell's 2008 discussion of the politics of relevance in geography help us understand the dichotomy that exists between the disciplines turned to social theory and what they see as a lack of direct community engagement. And they argue that, quote, while rapid theoretical development has perhaps drawn geography closer to the heart of main debates in the social sciences, it may have also drawn it further from the social movements, political formations, policymakers, and lay people many of us hope to reach. So moving away from the confines of academia to engage in local issues beyond just the research part presents many opportunities. Professionally, intellectually, engaging in local issues allowed me to use my theoretical training to provide nuanced opinions about solar development in my engagement in the day-to-day debates associated with this issue. My engagement in local discussions about solar power allowed me to learn diverse views and perspectives, because engaging in local issues as a scholar who advises and provides recommendations to local government officials as a member of the Utility Advisory Committee allowed me to connect with different actors in the community in new ways. For example, I moved from being a county resident, passively observing how the debate developed, to one with a more active role in which I engaged in sometimes extremely uncomfortable discussions about different issues in my community. It also provided a space where I could share my opinions, listen to others, and see politics playing from the front seat. In these moments, I learned about the complexities of local politics, the perspective of different actors, and the implications of my position about an issue with great nuance. I observed how policies and laws are interpreted differently and gained a greater understanding of local implications of energy policies developed at state level. And I also was able to bring my academic training to bear. So now let's turn to some of the challenges. The first challenge is definitely time management. how to balance my institutional responsibilities of service, teaching, and scholarship, while also engaging in local issues. I was a tenure track assistant professor directing the institute and still directing the degree program when the solar debates was developing. In this context, I received several requests to participate in community events and roundtable discussions to provide my academic opinion about energy issues, especially solar development in Kittitas County. The second challenge, or related challenge, has been making sure that my department and university considers my local engagement part of my service requirements. It is my belief that engaging in local issues is not an external endeavor outside of the faculty member's responsibility. Instead, as Booth in 2007 contends, quote, we should reconceptualize and refocus this engagement as inherent to faculty members' work as teachers and scholars, end quote. Perhaps one of the reasons why there is a lack of engagement in local issues among critical resource geographers is the institutional constraint over what counts as service and scholarship for tenure and promotion. Klein 2011 stated that universities should support research agendas that benefit the community, quote, through financial means, relief from other professional obligations, and recognition of professional and learning achievements, end quote. However, as Booth contends, faculty are often not rewarded for linking their courses to their communities, grounding their research in real-life community dilemmas, or disseminating their research to non-academic audiences. Let me now turn to the lesson learned, and I'm getting to the very end of my intervention. Many critical resource geographers engage with communities where their research takes place. In my case, it was Venezuela and Argentina. However, I learned that there are differences between going to live with a community for an extended period of time to conduct participatory observation and ethnographic research, and engaging in the local issues where you live and where you work. One difference is the fact that in the latter case, my views are scrutinized not only by community residents, but also by my colleagues and administrators of the university where I work. In other words, with local engagement, there may be no leaving the field. I also learned that engaging in local issues does not fit neatly within the fieldwork period, and that the interactions can be difficult. The demands associated with local engagement can seep into different aspects of the daily routine. For example, I interact within and outside of working hours with other county residents and colleagues and administrators who might have disagreed with my views about the solar projects and the debates taking place in the cities, as it rely more on solar power. The same can be said about my research in Argentina and Venezuela. However, there I only do fieldwork for a short amount of time. That is not the case when I am engaging with community debates about resource issues where I live and work. So in this context, the dynamics of academic practice and community engagement has shifted because I am not limited by the space and timeframe constraints of conducting research in a distant place. To conclude, moving beyond the confines of academia to engage in local resource issues is physically, intellectually, and emotionally demanding. Indeed, engaging in community issues at home is not easy, in part because it forces faculty members to confront the limits of their identity as productive and effective scholars where they live. Regardless of how stressful, contradictory, or messy academic practice might be, I believe it is important to move beyond the confines of academia because scholars have a social responsibility to use our expertise to engage in controversial local issues and make a difference on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alvin, for sharing your experiences and for that rich discussion and for the call for social responsibility of researchers to do this type of work.
Thank you.
So next up, we have Michael Dunaway. So Michael is a future professor's postdoc in the sociology department at Syracuse University and a member of the Choctaw Nation. His research examines indigenous energy sovereignty, focused on the ways Native American tribes assess the best renewable energy technologies for their tribe. And he will be discussing energy sovereignty frameworks with us. Michael, take it away.
Marissa, thank you for that introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because talking about energy sovereignty is a lot easier to understand and conceptualize if you can kind of visualize the interaction of the components. So energy sovereignty is a process that moves a community from energy poverty to energy security. So energy poverty is when a community members pay more than 10% of their income towards energy costs. And in Native American communities, that is a lot of the community members. But tribes can engage and strengthen their energy sovereignty through making decisions that encourage their own kind of ways of interacting with energy. So these kind of come down to these fundamental underpinnings of culture, economics, technology, and ecology. So culture is, as Cornell and Colt called, a cultural match with the technology. So a community is more likely to use, maintain, have buy-in for technologies that are more in line with their culture. So to increase the success of a project, you want to make sure that the project itself aligns well with the culture. Economically, you want to make sure that the technology, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, any of those, will be economically efficient. So how quickly can a technology pay itself off, become a benefit? Does it reduce costs? Those types of decisions being made from the community and not outside sources help strengthen that kind of decision-making process towards energy security. So the technical or technology element isn't just about like technological efficiency, but it's also about the people's ability to utilize that technology. So how much training, what kind of human resources are needed to maintain, to build, to deconstruct energy projects over the long term. So it's not just about the technology itself, but the human component and how well they interact with that technology. And finally, the ecological part is how much does it impact the local environment? So does it cause harm to the environment? Are there issues with that? Those are things that communities take into account when they're thinking about development projects as a whole, and specifically energy projects. So to give you kind of an example of how these things interact with each other. So hydroelectric energy is very technologically efficient. It has a very high EROI. It has a very low human resource investment, but a lot of tribes that have river cultures do not want to dam those rivers and halt like the flow of fish migration. So that's an ecological issue and a cultural issue. So going to that community and not having those conversations and just pitching hydroelectric energy sources may be a detriment to kind of getting the community on board with the project. So one of the things about this kind of framework of culture, economics, technology, and ecology, all of that is kind of framed into this concept of technological appropriateness. So when you're looking at a renewable energy project or an energy project, you want to think about things like who has access to the energy? How many choices do the community have for sources of energy? Is there healthier versions of those choices that you can have? Who benefits from the extraction and transportation and refining of the resources? So one of the issues along those lines is that tribes do not generally have their own energy production companies. And so the money that they pay for energy goes off reservation. And it's hard to accrue generational wealth when all the money is leaving the community. So, and the final element of that is things like waste, things like, you know, who is bearing the burden of the cost of the energy production. And then a lot of times the community, the indigenous communities bear a high burden for energy production, but they do not receive benefit equal to the burden. And that's one of the fundamental issues that these communities have with energy projects. So energy security would be able to control access, control the types of choices, quality of energy, who benefits, reducing burdens, things like that. And so energy security is this very complex kind of goal that energy sovereignty is in the process of doing so. And each time a community makes their own decisions about energy, they're taking a step towards that kind of concept of energy security. The final thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that you can use this kind of framework to attack energy issues in a lot of different ways. So if you're more interested in culture, that's one way that you can interact with communities about their energy projects. Economics, technology, ecology, and in addition, this framework doesn't just work for energy sovereignty, but food sovereignty, water sovereignty, health sovereignty, housing sovereignty. All those things can fit into this framework. So you can engage from a lot of different perspectives and support communities while conducting really rich research and empowering these communities to making their own decisions. So with that, I would like to wrap it up and pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Michael, so much. I think that you gave us a lot of insight into why it's important to engage communities and ways that we can kind of support initiatives, but that requires a kind of a very close relationship and close reading of communities. So thank you very much. So next up, we have Kelly Roma. So Kelly is a PhD candidate at Montana State University, where she studies rural community resilience, policy, and planning, shaping community energy transitions. She'll be talking about the value of community engaged work, some practical realities of doing community engaged work, and some intersections with theory. So welcome, Kelly.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much, Marissa, and to the panelists for this great session. I'm already seeing a lot of cross-cutting themes and really looking forward to the discussion. As Marissa mentioned, my name is Kelly Romer. I'm a PhD candidate at Montana State University. I live and work here in Montana. I am advised by Julia Haggerty in the Resources and Communities Research Group. Our group is really oriented around studying the intersection of natural resource development and economic and community well-being. There's several of us who are studying this intersection in energy communities. You might know predecessors and alums, Chris Smith and Katie Bills Walsh. And I just want to, couch my remarks with, I'm a junior scholar and I don't want to speak beyond my expertise or out of my authority. I have so much to learn about community engaged research. That said, I'm eager to participate and offer the perspective of a graduate student and someone who really cares about, this aspect of research. And so I organized my thoughts around some of the prompts in the session overview. I'd like to first conceptualize how I approach community engaged research, some thoughts about how this type of work can really benefit energy research in general, and some practical thoughts for students considering this type of study. And so my conceptualization of community engaged research is really aligned with an ideal of the land grant institution mission, which is to conduct research that can inform practice and support community economic well-being in communities across the state. In my time working with Julia and the Resources and Communities Research Group, I've really benefited from many opportunities to participate in community engaged research, to really understand that it can and should take many different forms depending on the duration of the project, the duration of the researcher, and what is appropriate for that community and the context. I've helped with the planning and running of seminars and field trips that will hopefully support relationship building between our group and the university that will last longer than my PhD program, hopefully. And also to assisting with discrete projects that provide technical assistance to communities who, running peer-to-peer workshops or helping with meeting facilitation. And my work in my dissertation has fallen somewhere in between some broad strokes of that work. My dissertation is really focused on how rural and remote communities are navigating the social and economic impacts of the coal transition. I have been a little fortunate and a little strategic, unlike, as Elvin found out, sometimes doing research close to home can have its benefits in a time when travel is tough. My community case study happens to only be 5 hours away from where I live. This has allowed me to take a very slow and intentional approach to conducting that case study. And when I came to MSU about 4.5 years ago, I began visiting, attending community meetings, public events, to just be there, introduce myself and my research to leaders. And in a place where the transition dynamic is really well covered by the media, community leaders and residents are particularly wary about how they are perceived and portrayed. And so it has taken me several years before I was comfortable enough to ask for their time and bring my research questions to them. And as I shared those questions and discussed what's going on in the community, I worked to form an advisory board, and the questions evolved further, and finally had the opportunity, when pandemic sort of had a gap, to conduct interviews last summer, and I intend to share those findings back to the research participants. That's just a big overview, and I find that this type of work can really provide a lot of insight and I think contributions to the growing body of energy transition research. There's a lot of work on the social and economic impacts of decarbonization, and it has been critiqued for sometimes being overly technocratic or using jobs gained or lost as proxies for broader social and economic dynamics. There's a recent article by Bazillion that articulates that some of these social and economic interactions in specific fossil communities are not well studied and well understood. And when legacy communities experience disruption, we don't have the tools for immediate and effective policy decisions. And I think this engaged work with the geographical perspective can really contribute insight into that experience of disruption at the local level. One of the big challenges for remote isolated communities is that the transition is happening as industrial closure and economic restructuring, and it needs to be considered as such, and transition assistance that's designed for other contexts isn't well suited to the needs of the community. And so, through conversations and with stakeholders and identifying these challenges, there's a lot that can be learned by really digging into the community processes, as well as some, such as planning or public finance, some of these like mundane community day-to-day activities that can really inform the types of decisions that community members and leaders are facing and why it's so hard to transition. And then finally, I wanted to just share some practical, food for thought for graduate students interested in this type of work. I saw that Adrian is on the call. I want to give a shout out to some recent research on research fatigue in energy communities. Energy communities host nationally and internationally significant infrastructure. Individuals are often asked to answer sets of social and policy questions that are of national and international interest. And we also need to take seriously their capacity to respond to many of these questions. Research fatigue or apathy, indifference brought on by overexposure to engaging in research or being researched can be attributed to a lack of alignment in mutual benefits or shared interests, lack of impact. And so it's important to, before you go to a community, to take on that responsibility to do the legwork to find out as much as you can about the community before you start, as well as what research has already been done in that community, connect with different researchers. It's something that we could be better at, is talking to other people studying it, and maybe we can share data or coordinate talks to better respect people's time and they're the people we want to talk to are often the busiest people doing the work in the community. So make sure that we take that seriously. And it's also important to ask yourself an important question, which is, am I a good research partner for this community? So to make sure that this is not an extractive process, and think about who you are to the community. So I'm a PhD student whose career may or may not continue in this state or in this specific line of inquiry. So I'm hesitant to start a level of engagement that would end when I graduate. And if that would cause harm, or if that's exactly what they want, then that really needs to be part of the decision-making process for this type of study. And I'd like to end just with a question for the panel, if we have time, is it's important to share research and findings back to the community. And I wonder how our panelists, experts, and our experienced colleagues in the audience can think and consider the how do you share critical findings back to your research participants? So with that, thank you so much.
Trying to find my little clapping emoji. Thank you, Kelly, so much for some really impressive research and also some really interesting insights. And thank you for ending on that provocation. In the interest of time, I think we'll start with that provocation once we start the discussion. So we'll head over to Tom, and then we'll get right back to that provocation because it's a really important one. So with that, we will now move to Tom Patak. So Tom is an assistant professor at Texas State University. His research spans energy transitions, climate change and sustainability, as well as issues around hydropower. And he'll talk to us about the challenges of co-producing knowledge. So picking up on the question of extractive knowledge and how to not do that. So he'll pick up there where Kelly left off. And he'll also talk to us about interrogating the appropriation of concepts of community in work in energy. So Tom, take it away.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you to the other participants for their great insights. I guess I want to start by saying this type of work is really hard. It's not easy. But it can and often does yield these sort of deeper and more nuanced, sort of comprehensive insights. And I feel that's a sort of compelling reason that sort of draws many of us to this type of work. It's often not the type of work you can simply pop out and do in a few hours. Although, we have heard from panelists here who are doing community engaged work in their own communities. One of my field sites was in a very remote river valley in one of the sort of most isolated parts of China. It's about 24 hours away from a major city with multiple buses and minivans to get there. It's incredibly isolated and really tough terrain. And that means that I guess you put yourself at some degree of risk if you in case you get sick or injured. It's often not comfortable. It's physically uncomfortable being there. And it can get pretty lonely. If you're out in the field for long stretches of time, you really sort of feel the isolation. But I feel that it is often very worthwhile. And being in the field or being in amongst the community, to me, is a really big part and maybe the essence of sort of geography and geographic inquiry. So I want to talk just about a couple of challenges. The main one is protecting your community if they are vulnerable, and if the work that you do puts any part of that community at risk. And this is particularly crucial if you work in an environment where you're sort of rubbing up against an authoritarian government, or any type of situation where the community members are at odds with the type of energy development that's occurring. And we probably can all nod our heads that that's a common situation. So for me, what this meant, and I think for a lot of us, is being really, really intentional about the type of research that we would undertake. And what it meant in my particular case was having, of course, having to de-identify particular participants. But what it also meant was having to exclude a lot of data from my study and not publish particular results that may have sort of, made a bit of a splash, but may have also identified a particular community and specific respondents. My particular work was looking at small hydro and also sort of a diversion hydro that's not often associated with forced relocation of communities. We tend to associate relocation with hydropower around large dams. But what I found was that there were sort of small communities that were relocated due to these small dams and diversion stations. And I was hypothesizing that cumulatively, these numbers are often completely neglected or underreported. And, they potentially would add up when you consider, China maybe has 80,000 small hydroelectric plants, that they might sort of add up to something that rivals the relocations that come with large dams. Publishing something of that material would have completely exposed the community I was working with, so I chose to just leave that. So the second point I want to talk about, and this is drawing directly on what Kelly said, was how do I not recolonize the community that I work with? And this is something that I have agonized. I agonized over going into the field. I agonized sort of, while I was there, and it's constantly something that has made me incredibly uncomfortable. Because I've come to the conclusion that it was essentially impossible for me to avoid. I'm a white male. I was going to work in a really impoverished community in the global South to conduct research, to extract data as part of my PhD, to use that data to obtain a doctorate, and then hopefully a career. So what I tried to do was be as least extractive as possible, and try to tell the story of the community as much as I could, and not tell my story through their experiences. Of course, I shared data with them, and of course, I tried to structure my research in a meaningful way, engage in sort of immersive methods such as participant observation for 6 months before going in to do formal data collection, multiple trips into the field, so that I could really, I guess, deeply understand as much as I could some of the challenges that I was working with in the community, and try to reflect them as holistically and as accurately as I could. Again, it's something I've really struggled with and still struggle with, because I'm not sure that I've ever arrived at a point that I'm sort of even remotely comfortable. But the next point, I mean, this is sort of, I guess, a step in the right direction, which was, try to always, of course, do some good in the community beyond simply doing your research. And what that really means, I guess, is trying to build community, trying to work with the community. And, for a lot of that, this, was literally working with the community. So when you're in the community, they really appreciated my labor. And this was a very rural community, and it's easy to sort of romanticize what working, living in the countryside looks like. But when you've been building fences for about 7 days, that's really difficult work. So, really sort of being part of the sort of Danwei or the work unit for extended periods of time, and sort of using that opportunity to sort of develop, I guess, relationships with community members, and be as genuine as you could. Use that time to think about what benefit sharing mechanisms might look like in the community. So I've been going back to this community for over 10 years now. I've watched children grow up, parts of that community have watched my children grow up over sort of various social media apps. And I've seen that community change a whole lot. But being involved in that community and being genuine, it also means that you might have to do things that are challenging, not simply building fences or helping out with roads, but it might mean engaging in specific rituals that you may otherwise not want to engage in. And that might mean eating specific things that you find incredibly challenging. And one of the things that was challenging for me was the sheer amount of alcohol that was presented to me. This is really common working in rural China, literally around breakfast time, going into people's houses, and it was just an expectation that if you were presented with a beer or something else, that you really had to drink it, because this was hospitality. This was authenticity, and this was, how you sort of build trust and reciprocity. So the last thing I want to talk about was sort of conducting critical scholarship on what this term, a community, actually means, and how is it used, and how is it potentially misappropriated in by developers. So one just small example is, we've been working on sort of really critically analyzing the development proliferation of community solar in the United States. And we were interested to find out how community serving a lot of these arrays were. With some sort of, basic research, we found that overwhelmingly, in many cases, these developments were actually really not designed and developed to serve the interests of communities at all. And in fact, many community solar arrays were sort of termed community merely if they served a sort of disparate group of members in one particular utility service area. And what we found was that developers were really hijacking this term and saying, oh, we're doing community solar, but in many cases, this was only available for businesses or utility scale solar development. So what we did is we came up with we coined this fancy term. We called it community washing, to sort of detail how, you know, this term is being used. We didn't really find a lot of literature that really pokes at this issue. And we found that, you know, as part of our charge as critical energy scholars, particularly geographers, this was a really, really, for us, a valuable sort of line of inquiry. So they're my sort of 4 points. That's my insight. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Tom. That was fantastic, and also very sort of personable. I liked the you took us into the field with you, so that was really interesting. So I think that you know, a lot of the points about sort of ways to not be extractive, I think that is kind of like one of the themes that comes through these wonderful panel presentations. And I want to just, I guess, go right back to Kelly's question and think about the question of the importance of sharing findings and sort of how to do that, and pose that to the panelists to get some of the discussion going. So please feel free to unmute, whoever wants to take a stab at that one.
Well, I'd like to jump right in. So one way in my research in Venezuela, I started doing exploratory visits for in 2003 and 2005 for 3 months each time, to kind of like identify gatekeepers and understand the landscape and start to build these relationships. By then 2006, 2007, I stayed for 13 months, all the entire time. And so that included all sorts of different activities in Caracas, Maracaibo, and the fishing community of Ancon de Turre. And one of the things that, just like what was shared by Tom, it involves just not just extracting the information. In my case, what I found was that although I am a Latino, I'm from the Caribbean, an islander, the political relationship that exists between the United States and Puerto Rico being a neo-colony of the United States, and the institution that I was representing, I was doing my PhD at the Maxwell School of Citizenships and Public Affairs at Syracuse, put me in a very interesting situation every time I had to engage with government officials or scholars that were affiliated or sympathetic to the Bolivarian Revolution. So negotiating those encounters was very interesting. But in the process, I learned a lot. And one way in which I was able to share the information was to make those articles available, but also by doing follow-up in terms of my transcripts. I shared all of that with all of the members that I interviewed. I asked them, am I interpreting this correctly? Is there anything here that I misunderstood? Did you mean something else? And that required a follow-up, constant communication where the participant became engaged and also claimed ownership of the data. So that was one way. In Argentina, it was also a very rural community. I did not live in the community because of the spike in the housing prices, because the community is experiencing a literal boomtown scenario of wild west, of gambling, prostitution, drug addiction, very like collapse services because of a town of 2,500 booming to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But in that, so I found a place in the city of Neuquén, and I commuted every day and stayed the entire day and then commuted back to where I was staying. In that particular case, the engagement was more with the environmental, the non-governmental organizations and environmental activists, and doing the same thing I described for Venezuela, but also collaborating with them in other areas. So although I have not done this, it's something that is still in plans and in development of blogs, white papers, articles, etc., that can be published locally in their language, and as well as following up with them and providing them with every publication or intervention that comes out of that data that they share with me. So those are the ways.
So to just kind of add on to that, I wanted to let you know about a couple of resources. First, the AAG's Indigenous People Specialty Group has a declaration of key questions to ask in working with Indigenous communities. And that extends to marginalized and historically underrepresented communities as well. The Environmental and Planning F is putting out a publication here in a little bit called Indigenous Research Sovereignty, where we're going to be covering several different kind of ways that this has been done in kind of in action. But to kind of get more specific, the key thing, since Kelly, you were talking about that you have a community advisory board, you need to work with them and ask them, how do they want that data presented? Do they want it translated? Do they want it in paper or digital, or what works for them? Thinking about giving them the community co-authorship so that they have a voice in academia, being consultants for the paper so that they can have a voice in how they're represented, because when you publish, you're representing that community. Questions of what they want to kind of editorial control, what they want to have, what they want cut, things like that is also going to be important. But also, you know, thinking about the community as co-owners of the data, like you would a co-author or anyone else. What kind of permissions would you get from a co-author? What kind of editorial control would you give a co-author? This information is theirs, and you going out, you're the one who's borrowing it from them. So asking permissions, asking for the cultural protocols, that's what your community advisory board is really there for, along with, you know, validating your data, resolving conflicts, all those other things that they do. That's another conversation that needs to be had. And those types of questions that you need to ask and ask yourself, you can get in the IPSG's declaration. And if you want, I can set up a link in the chat if you guys are interested.
I just actually searched for it and threw it up in the chat because I really like that. I've yeah, referenced that resource before. Did anyone else want to take a stab at that question, or?
Oh, can I ask just a quick follow-up that's related to this question? Kelly, I think in your remarks you said that you had put together a local advisory board, if I heard you right. Would you just tell us a little more about, you know, how you went about that and how that's playing a role in your work?
Yes, thank you so much. I have been meeting with certain, you know, key stakeholders for a few years now, and at this point the board is, they haven't met together, but they represent different aspects of the study. I didn't really talk about it, but I'm studying, you know, how community services will be affected by tax revenue decline. And so I have someone representing a service provider, someone with economic development, and then community development at a different scale. And so I introduced my research proposal and adjusted it, checked with them, and I have analyzed data, and I am planning to go share those back, do some member checking, and then definitely work with them to figure out what are the best ways to publicly share that back if it's a webinar or coordinate with another researcher in the area to, put on present the results at a community meeting. But that's sort of where I'm at in the process, and this has been extremely helpful. So thanks, everyone.
I just want to touch base with the person who asked the question. Were you asking how a community advisory board is formed, or what their function is?
No, I'm familiar with the concept and the function. I just was wondering how it's been playing out in Kelly's work so far. So,
okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, thanks. And it looks like Enrique has a question.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. I can say fantastic presentations. I have a question here, I guess, for everybody, but starting from Elvin. I know that this panel is about scholarship, but also we are teachers. Now, how we are dealing pedagogically speaking with the communities and even the students, as you say, Elvin, that you are connected to the local community where you live? Should we be activists in terms of almost Paulo Freire? How can we not only educate the people in front of us, but also absorbing the information gains, for instance, like Michael Donaway say about traditional knowledge? How pedagogically speaking can we put this also together with the scholarship? Thank you very much.
Wow, Enrique, you always ask these amazing questions. So that's a great question. One way in which I've been trying to allow my research to inform my teaching is by using the case, my research in these communities as case studies to conceptualize and demonstrate and visually demonstrate to the students how the theories and conceptual frameworks that we're discussing in class play out on the ground. So that's one way. Another way is, for example, using these critical approaches from, in my case, ecological Marxism, etc., and how to find ways to present this information to students in a way that they can understand. And one example of that is a piece I wrote for Journal of Geography and Higher Education, which was a special issue organized by Connor Harrison and Autumn back in 2016, I think, where I discuss how I, in a class that I teach, Energy and Society in the Environmental Studies program, how I use this idea of first and second contradiction, spatial fix, etc. And then I provide these examples in the context of energy studies. Another way is by bringing my graduate students in the Cultural and Environmental Resource Management program. My first two students developed their own research using political ecology and political economy of natural resources, theories, conceptual frameworks, etc., to fracking operations, one in Colorado and another one in Pennsylvania. But most recently, my most recent graduate student that is almost done, she is kind of joined my research locally on utility scale solar for her thesis. And so that's another way. And finally, by bringing my undergraduate students to attend public hearings, to get engaged in these processes at a local scale, by having more of a presence, more of an active role. And so I think those are some of the ways in which I try. I might not be successful, but I try to do it.
So Enrique, just to kind of follow up, since you kind of talked about traditional knowledge, I want to say that what Elvin is doing, bringing his students into the field, bringing the field into the classroom, that is really key. One of the other things that I advocate is changing how the students learn. So making sure that every student in my class has a voice and has space to speak, and to model the research methods that I use in the field in the classroom. So when I think about the classroom, as a research project, I'm asking the question, how do I know that my students are learning? So I use a visual charting exercise in the field to talk with the community about things that are important to them. I use that same exercise in the classroom to make sure that the students are understanding or being able to connect to complicated kind of concepts. So the thing that I focus on is today's students are tomorrow's researchers. And we're not going to change how research is done, and the communities will continue to be marginalized and underrepresented until we can get more scholars and researchers with those worldviews out into the field. And they won't be able to do it if we crush those worldviews in the classroom. So for me, that's how I kind of do my form of activism, and kind of the nod to FAIR and not being the banker of all the knowledge, distributing it out, but co-creating knowledge, because in the field, that's what you want to do as well, is co-create knowledge with the community members. So I'm doing that in the classroom, I'm doing that in the field.
One thing that I might add, just an anecdote from participating in a class called Growth and Change in the American West, where we it was a co-convened course that would go spend a weekend doing homestays with ranchers in central Montana. And it is, you know, a two-way knowledge sharing opportunity, and the students learned a lot about what it's like to live in central Montana. We did a lot of place-based, you know, talks from different producers and land managers, but the students also identified aspects of the community transitions or economic change, and they did poster sessions in the town hall as a way of, you know, sharing what they're learning in the class, but also in a way that could be useful to the members there, which was kind of a cool way to share, you know, critical ways of thinking about, you know, the economy and change in rural places. So it could be fun.
Yeah, what I've tried to do with my students is take them through my experiences in the field and use the power of storytelling, and, you know, try to sort of take them into the lives of the people in these communities in ways that they might, you know, begin to develop some of the complexities and some of the challenges that these communities face. And one of the ways that I have been experimenting is playing these sort of active role play simulations, where all of the students take different stakeholder positions and have to sort of advocate for a specific type of stakeholder, and go through a sort of scenario, and then we do a reflective exercise after. And I sort of intertwine this with the stories of the people in the communities that I've worked with, and then have them write responses at various stages during the term, because their perceptions will ultimately sort of change immediately after doing the exercise, and then a couple weeks later, etc. And I found that to be really powerful and really transformative. And for a lot of students, this is the first real, you know, engagement they've had with these issues, and it's just so foreign to them. And a lot of them have, you know, said that it's really challenging and they really struggle with it. But this is, I guess, the first step to sort of getting a handle on these really, really sort of complex scenarios. So, and just know also finally that it's just a work in progress. It's a process, and we're always looking for new ways and better ways to sort of do things as scholars.
I love that. And last time I did role play with my students, it was really fun, because the students really took, you know, particularly, you know, like not everyone wants to be sort of the big bad corporation, but I had students that literally took it and ran with it, and it ends up being like just really engaging and fun. But my case studies weren't ones that I was actually personally involved with, so I think that that's an additional way to really bring in actual community engaged research. I really like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to quickly sort of duck in there. You know, one of the things, what can happen is that, you know, when you have an energy development project in a community, it can really be divisive for these communities and really split them. And I've developed a simulation in a way where we actually have different community members. You know, it tries to sort of really bring to the surface some of the tensions that will manifest within a community. And it's not so much the community against the developer or against the government, but it really sort of shows that how the implications for the individual communities. So.
So I wanted to pick up on something that Edgar mentioned in the chat, and then it's sort of something that was mentioned across the different panels. But so Edgar was saying that, you know, that he feels that this type of work, community engaged work, is not adequately recognized by higher education institutions, especially when accounting for the resources and including time as a resource. And I think that is a really important point. And I think that many of you talked about sort of the not just time management, but also the time involved in this. And I guess, you know, we can think about it more broadly in terms of like the neoliberal pressures on the university, and Elvin mentioned tenure and promotion. And so, yeah, I wondered whether we could sort of dig into the challenges of, you know, institution, like how to make institutions value the work, tips and tricks, or you know, examples where they have valued it. And yeah, just sort of dig into that a little bit. There wasn't quite a direct question, but
in my case, I'll be very honest. My commitment has always been Latin America and the Caribbean, because of my background. So I've been biased, not because other research is not important, but because that's where my interest lies. And so I remember coming, and my focus has always been on fossil fuels. And when I started my tenure track here at Central, the landscape in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest, is completely different, the energy landscape. And so I was always interested in understanding the kind of socio-ecological, political, economic issues associated with the development of renewable energy, but never really had the time to engage in that because I was just developing my research and writing grants to travel and do the data. But COVID gave me that opportunity. And one of the things that I struggled with was how do I balance family, which is the eternal hurdle for scholars? Because as an administrator, you have 8 to 5, and then at 5 you're done. But scholar, it never ends. Family, work, and now having this active participation on a daily basis that was in the past constrained only to my visits during the summer, and some writings, transcription, etc., and analysis during the year. And so one of the things that in each department, each university works differently. They have different departmental guidelines and expectations, and etc. But in my case, we have to do what we call a workload plan, where you explain a year in advance. We're unionized, so everything is very structured. Where you explain, this is how much I'm going to do on research. These are the courses I'm doing teaching. These are the committees that I'm serving. This is my service in the department, the university, professional, etc. And then you have to, a year later, you submit an activity report explaining, okay, this is what I did. So it is in that specific structural context that I explained everything, provided all of the evidence of the time commitment, the things that I was doing, participating, giving lectures, etc. Invited presentations, keynote speaker in the community to address these issues, representing CWU and my role as the director, etc. So in that case, I used that instrument to demonstrate the time commitment. But in the end, as always, it's publish and perish. If you don't turn that into a publication, it doesn't really, I mean, it matters, but it doesn't really matter for your role, you know, when you're, so I was lucky, I went up for early tenure, I got tenure, I just submitted my file to be promoted to full, but it was a struggle. It required, you know, the usual, and I'm not alone, waking up at 4 before my daughters wake up just to get my writing done. And then when they wake up, engaging in cooking breakfast, getting them ready, the morning scramble, etc., and then going to school and to the office and teaching, advising students, etc., and doing a lot of other work at night when they go to bed. Not unique. I think this is kind of general, everybody, that's how we operate as scholars. But it comes at a cost of energy, perhaps lack of sleep, stress, etc. And so that's how I've been managing it.
I have absolutely no idea. That's just, you know, it's just, how do you square that circle? You're lucky that you're unionized, Elvin, and that you have that structure, because a lot of places aren't. And it's, in many other places, it's, you do your work, you do your teaching, you do your publications, you do your grants, you do your supervising. If you do community work, great. But if you don't, if you do all work with secondary data sets, it's really no difference. So it's what I sort of said at the start of my remarks. It's very, very, you know, it's hard physically, mentally, but the time constraints are overwhelming. But I think, you know, you just have to sort of make that commitment early and know what's in front of you, and know that, you know, you're probably going to have experiences and insights that, you know, potentially others don't. Again, still trying to figure it out. It's a work in process, you know, a work in process, right?
So for me as a postdoc, these are the types of things I'm considering moving forward. So the question of, do I want to be at a research facility kind of institution? Do I want to be at a teaching college? Do I want to be at a tribal college? These are questions I'm asking, and when I'm going through the interview process, I'm evaluating the institutions as much as they're evaluating me. But from my experience, I can say that learning to say no to things is huge, because especially as persons of color or underrepresented people in academia, everyone wants you to do everything and be on every committee and participate and do all these things that you don't always get credit for. The other thing is being willing to just stop and not do anything, because for me, I feel incredible pressure that, you know, there's not many Native American scholars at the PhD level. And if I'm not constantly working, if I'm not, you know, giving 110%, 20 hours a day, then somehow I'm betraying somebody else who could have had that spot, who would have worked harder, who would have pushed a little bit further. And so being able to forgive myself and say, you know what, I've got to take a break and clear my head and recharge my batteries and make time for myself, make time for my family, create those opportunities. Otherwise, I just kind of burn myself out. And when you work with, you know, these marginalized communities, it's easy to get kind of immersed in every single issue, everything, and every people looking at you as a solution for every problem. and you only have so much capacity. So being able to say no, being able to take time for yourself, both in academia and in the field, but also finding the right kind of academic fit so you can do the research that you want to do kind of in your own time frame while being academically and being successful. And I think that structure of publish or perish is starting to change because the nature of research is starting to change. And I'm hoping to kind of be on the cusp of that and pushing that paradigm shift forward, because doing work in these communities takes longer. It takes capacity building. It takes sitting and drinking 101 beers way too quickly and all these things to build those level of trust. When you have somebody else who can just go into a lab, create a bunch of experiments, push out 5 or 6 papers a year, you can't do that working with Indigenous communities. The other thing that I would like to say is you can also publish on the process of working with those communities, and that's hugely valuable. So even though you don't have the data, your experiences, journaling, reflexivity, anything you do to be reflexive, your group, all the reflexivity that they do, the issues that you find, solutions, those are things that are valuable to other scholars and can be published on as well. So anyway, thank you for the time.
Yeah, thanks for all of your insights, Michael. It's just really incredibly valuable, and really appreciate it.
Enrique, is that your hand up?
Yes, indeed, and I apologize if I am asking a second question, but
No, please.
Honestly, I think we had a similar common denominator the last year in the meeting that you organized. And I think this question or questions are totally necessary. What type of transformations the academia should have to integrate this practical element with the communities and our scholarship? Is there any example there? Is the system capable of making this transformation, or there is like a type of resistance against these connections with the communities? Thank you.
I'm skeptical. I think the system, I mean, just honestly, you know, that I think that the system is interested in interactions that yield grants and publications. And this is essentially, you know, what Kelly mentioned, an extractive process. So shifting that around would, you know, I feel that there is sort of a lot to potentially lose from the academy in a short-sighted way, in the way that they can see what they could yield from these relationships, but not what they could gain. And that's unfortunate to say that, but you know, all of us that work in these types of communities understand all of the value beyond simply grant dollars and publications, right? But I think our voices are probably in the minority, and we probably don't have a stake at the table as much as we would like to have those conversations. That's my sense. Others might have different views, I'm not sure.
So the thing that I've been facing is that the system rewards extractive research with these communities because it's quicker, it's easier. If you don't care if you hurt people, if you don't care if you publish damaging data, and you just can come in and leave and never see that community again and move on to the next committee or community to write another paper, to write another grant, that's what's rewarded. But I don't know, honestly, one of the things that I have been considering is to quit caring about tenure and to publish higher quality, higher impact articles so that after I get established, and it may take longer to get tenure, the university is then coming to me saying, why aren't you tenured? Why we need to get you tenured. You're too valuable for us because you have all these high impact things. And so I think that's the only way that we can change the culture, is by a generation of scholars going, you know what, we don't care about tenure anymore. We don't care about publish or perish. We want to publish high quality, high impact, and fewer articles. And I am starting to see a shift in the tenure structure where they're looking at the number of people who are reading your article, not just impact factor of the journal, but number of people accessing it, number of people citing your articles. And so I think that that is going to change, but it will only be spurred if more and more scholars say, we're not going to publish or perish. Go ahead and let us perish. We'll move to another institution. And when we become that high impact scholar, your institution is going to be the one that loses out.
I really like that point about sort of working on higher quality publications instead of, you know, higher number of publications. And I think that there are some, I feel like there are some sort of slow scholarship movements that might speak to that, about really kind of, you know, not just churning out papers that are really kind of less value, but sort of slowing down. And I added in the chat an article about Tufts University. So some folks over there who are producing this transformative co-learning model, but essentially it was partnering up and creating an internal sort of institutional structure to do community engaged work. But it is one of the, you know, I tried to pull a bunch of research and see what there was, and this is probably, you know, the only article that talks about something like that. That doesn't mean that these things don't, you know, aren't happening, but I'd like to see more on the sort of institutional capacity developing. But I guess I just wanted to lighten it, because it was very sort of, it's not going to change, and that it's very slow to change. Let's admit it. But there are like tiny pockets of deviant institutions and scholars doing that work. I do realize we are now 5 minutes over time, so I mean, we have the room for another 15 minutes. We do have the energy geography coffee hour, virtual coffee hour. So we can continue some of these conversations, but I guess I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists and our wonderful attendees with your questions and insights. And this was just really, really great. And I hope it's just the start of these conversations. So yeah, just thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing, sharing your insights.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.